I want to move on to the Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity. Is this it? That's not it. That's it. This poem, written in 1629, when he's 21 years of age, is strictly speaking a hymn. Now, in terms of hymns, in contemporary culture, in the church, many denominations don't even sing hymns. In the more, those that are more interested in contemporary worship, they tend to sing lyric poems, which are freer and less structured and less, when I say less structured, poetically less structured and metrically less structured. The lines go longer, they don't observe a regularity about them, they follow the emotive demands of the song itself. So you'll notice that they tend to be more expressive in that sense, and emotions are largely things that are less regulated, especially when we're expressing adoration or awe or love. There's a profusion of sentiment at that point, and contemporary worship lyrics tend to be expressive in that sense. And so they're less bound by poetic structure, whether it's in the form of line length or syntax, for that matter. So it's more, it's less, I would say the language is simpler and more expressive. It's more in romantic sensibilities. And so when we speak of hymns, it tends to be the denominations that are more traditional that use hymns, right? Or at least in evangelicalism, we associate hymns with a particular type of Christianity, and to some degree a dead old Christendom to some degree. And within those denominations that sing hymns, there is the general sensibility amongst evangelicals, at least young evangelicals, that hymns are traditionalist and are actually the vehicle for a more fervent biblical piety. That's amongst those that sing hymns. We're closer to the Spirit of God. We're going to be restrained in our expression. We're going to be more biblical in our expression. We're going to be more tempered by meter and rhythm and structure. But interestingly, that view is not the dominant view amongst the Puritans. Amongst the Puritans of Milton's day, they would not sing hymns. They would have sung the metrical psalms. Not the hymns at all. The hymn is a pagan form of writing. Hymns are dedicated to pagan gods. And so when Christians write hymns, they are adopting a pagan form of literature as a vehicle for Christian sentiment. So they're already involved in the Renaissance, and they're rescuing a form of literature or a form of praise dedicated to the gods and reworking it for Christian sentiments. And some within their camp, and the more conservative and traditionalists among them, will object that this does not honor God at all. And amongst them are the Anglicans. The Anglicans do not sing hymns in the 17th century. They sing the Psalms only. Shocks people, because most people associate the Anglicans with traditionalism and so forth, and are going to assume, because we on this side of history think that hymns are a traditional form, that the Anglicans must have sung hymns, but they didn't in the 17th century or the 18th century. It's a late development. It's a 19th century development that Anglicans even use hymns. Now, who does sing hymns? Wesley and Watts. In other words, the Methodists. And the Methodists are thereby will be accused by the Anglicans of engaging in a poetic form that is actually, in some, well, they're going to say it's contrary to the way God demands to be praised. And it's called the regulative principle of worship. God gives us in his own word the words with which we are to praise him. We're not to create our own poetry. Even if we call it a hymn, and that's dedicated to God, that's a type of poetry that is that God does not sanction. He doesn't prohibit it either, but he does not sanction it, and we want to be puritanical in our commitment to God, and we're going to do what God commands of us, so we are going to sing his praise lyrics, which we find in the Psalms. That's it. So I think that alone is interesting. Some denominations only sing metrical psalms to this day, the most conservative ones. And you don't find many of them, but they are there. They won't even sing hymns for that reason. But the standard evangelical position since the 19th century, since Wesley and Watt and so forth, is to sing hymns. But by doing so, they are actually effectively engaging with classical culture, because again, the hymn is a classical form of praise dedicated to pagan gods, and now they're dedicating it to a Christian God. So whether you agree with it or not, I just wanted you to be aware of the fact that a hymn is actually a classical literary form. And Milton, in writing Ode on the Morning of Christ's Nativity, begins with a hymn. And strictly speaking, this is a hymn. As for an ode, odes are dedicated to certain subject matters as well. The word ode is a song. That's all that an ode is. But odes are often addressed to particular subjects. Now, so Pindar's odes, for instance, P-I-N-D-A-R, Pindar dedicates his odes largely to the Olympic Games. Victorious athletes engaging in an activity that deserves a monument or praise, and achieve something so splendid that a memorial is necessary. So you'll note that this is called an ode by Milton, and yet there are two parts to the ode. There's the first 4 stanzas, and then there's the hymn proper. So he begins with an ode, and then he moves to a hymn. Right? You can see that the way it's laid out here on the page here. It begins with a structured series of 7-line stanzas that gives way to then the hymn, which has a rather different, it takes on a different trajectory. But in both cases, he's using a pagan form of writing and fusing it with Christian sentiment. And so Milton has no problem with engaging with the classical world, and he's giving us a model for how to do it. Again, some of our puritanical brethren, and as I say, the mainstream Protestant church in England is not going to sing hymns in the 17th century. So this is controversial on Milton's part, and it marks him actually to some degree amongst the Puritans of his day as compromising. He's compromising by dedicating a poem on Christ's nativity and writing it in the form of a hymn. Like, that's the controversial bit, because hymns are for pagan gods, and he's saying this is not a pagan god, this is the God. I just wanted to say that because you don't have a sense that Milton could be doing something like that. But he's on the, I would say, the liberal end of Puritanism then. He's even going to engage in classical culture. There are those in his ranks that are going to want nothing to do with the arts whatsoever. And the Puritans famously closed theaters for that reasons. Milton puts on theatrical productions. He composes them. He engages in the arts. So again, we tend to think of Milton as this puritanical, very conservative figure. That's not how he would have been perceived in his own day. Okay, he's on the liberal wing of the puritanical movement. He is open to culture of the ancient world and is committed to reforging the sword of the ancient world and using it just like Aragorn does in that sense. He's going to reforge the sword of the classical world and use it for Christian purposes. That characterizes Milton's whole poetic life. So as I say, by Milton's day, hymns, when they are sung, are associated with songs sung in unison by the congregation at Christian worship, and the ode was any poem of praise. Now, the subject of this Nativity Ode is obviously the incarnation of the Son. The incarnation of the Son of God. And Milton sees this event in cosmic terms. And this is what marks this poem and marks Milton's particular genius on the incarnation, is he presents it in terms that we would see more strongly emphasized amongst Orthodox Christians. Christ as the Pantocrator, the ruler of all things. In the incarnation, we have the ruler of all nature coming. Not Christ the Redeemer, not Christ the Messiah even, but more the ruler of all things, all of nature. So it's a natural setting, and yet what is coming is the God who rules the very things in the context of which he's being born. And to that, the pagan deities are going to be silenced, and the whole of creation is going to erupt in praise and song in annunciation of the significance of this birth. So it's very much romantic in the sense of its emphasis on nature, and yet it's not romantic in the emphasis that the nature that gives praise to Christ gives him praise because he's the God of nature. Yes?
What was the term that you used for that?
Christus Pantocrator. Crat meaning rule, democrat. For instance, the rule of the Democrats, but he's the rule of all, Panto. The ode is composed of a 4-stanza introduction in modified rhyme royale, and then there are 27 stanzas within the hymn. So 31 stanzas altogether, not a short work. The rhyme royale stanza is 7 decasyllabic lines rhyming A, B, B, C, C. And rather unusually, the final line of the first 4 stanzas here is 12 syllables rather than 10. So the foregoing lines, these first 6 are 10 syllables, whereas this one's 12. And so that's called an Alexandrine, if you want to know. But you'll note that each of the concluding lines of the first 4 stanzas has 12 syllables rather than 10. It intentionally goes a little bit longer. Very unusual. And so it shows the influence of French poetics here, because the Alexandrines are very popular in French poetics. So Milton has been reading French poetry. Oh yes, he can read French and speak French as well as Italian and Latin, right? But he's not writing in French here, but he's clearly read and seen the influence of that, and it's influencing his own poetic line. Now, for Milton and his audience, the 12-syllable line would recall the final line of the stanza of Spenser's Faerie Queene. You can call it hexameter, if you will. And he probably has Spenser's poetry in mind. Spenser, who also writes the Shepherd's Calendar, shepherd referring to Christ. So again, he's deeply steeped and has in mind contemporary writers. And the effect of the lengthier line is to make each stanza a more pronouncedly integral unit, that it separates it from the previous lines. So if you have 10 syllable lines and then you punctuate it with a 12-syllable line, it makes it clear that what we see as the numbers between this are also emphasized by the longer. It's a longer pause. We could call it a syncopated rhythm these days. So it gives a greater structure than would otherwise be apparent if he just did another 10-syllable line. So the first 4 stanzas, I'm going to take them as a whole, and then we'll move to the hymn proper. These 4 stanzas neatly divide into 2. 2 stanzas are dedicated to the occasion and the subject of the poem, and the second two stanzas on the poet's desire to offer his poem as an actual gift to the Christ child. So one is the occasion and the subject of the poem, the first two stanzas, and the second are the poetic's desire to offer it as an offering, just like the Magi. He has a gift to give. So the opening stanza gives us the occasion. This is the month, and this the happy morn, wherein the Son of Heaven's eternal King, of wedded maid and virgin mother born, our great redemption from above did bring. For so the holy sages once did sing, that he our deadly forfeit should release, and with his Father work us a perpetual peace. So as the prophets of the Old Testament foretell, the Son of God would come down to earth from above. So it's God coming down and dwelling amongst us, Emmanuel. And by dying on the cross, which is not referred to here, but rather in line 152, only, which is preserved for dramatic effect, we're seeing a lengthy pause that nonetheless is connected with the very incarnation. The very purpose for God to come down is to redeem us from our sins. But he makes no mention of that at the beginning. And it's not the downbeat of the importance of the incarnation, at least as he sees it. The downbeat of it is the cosmological significance of it, which is, in general, in evangelicalism, much understated. All things are brought under Christ's dominion. All things. He's the ruler of all things. He's Lord of all things. What we see in Colossians 1, verses 15 and onwards. That's the emphasis of Milton's poem. All things. And the all things is going to include a great deal of things, as we'll see in the rest of the poem. So he states the subject of the poem here, somewhat abstractly. And in the second two stanzas of the introduction, he brings us right to the present moment. That glorious beam, that light insufferable, and that far beaming blaze of majesty wherewith he wont at heaven's high council table to sit the midst of trinal unity, he laid aside, and here with us to be forsook the courts of everlasting day to choose with us a darksome house of mortal clay. Very adeptly brings to mind the contrast between light and darkness, and glory and humility, which are going to characterize his understanding of the incarnation. And the paradox therein is that this condescension of God to the darksome house of mortal clay is nonetheless for the purposes of redeeming all of creation. So in the most humble act that could be conceived, the most powerful act imaginable will be brought about. And that is completed in the crucifixion and the resurrection, but to some degree it's already anticipated in the incarnation itself. The incarnation is already showing that God will condescend in a way that we don't merit. So, and the scene is set and the time is set at dawn. Say, heavenly muse, shall not thy sacred vein afford a present to the infant God? Hast thou no verse, no hymn or solemn strain to welcome him to this new abode? Now, while the heaven by the sun's team untrod hath took no print of the approaching light, and all the spangled host keep watch in squadrons bright. So the idea of the so having enunciated the significance, the cosmic significance of this one event, he can't stop himself from immediately wanting to praise. So it's a response marked by his awareness that grace has been given in the incarnation itself even. And he immediately transitions to this desire to praise the Messiah that has come down. And so he looks to the east and collapses the separation of present and past and sees three kings of Scripture, here presented as wizards, interestingly. Isn't that interesting? The wise men are wizards. Same connotation, right? The same root. Now, we associate wizards, well, now with Gandalf, of course, but it's actually a wizard is a wise man. That's the etymology of a wizard. And obviously associated with these three wise men who come from the east to offer up gifts to the newborn king, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, later mentioned. But these men who hasten to Jesus' cradle with their gifts, he wants to beat them there. So such is his fervor, he, as a man who is also wise and knows the significance of the incarnation, also wants to rush to the birth. And it's almost as if he can do it. So the fact that he's writing this poem in 1629 is irrelevant. He's imagining that the birth is just happening, and he wants to get there before the wise men arrive. Now, I've read scholars suggest that the wise men actually arrive 6 months after Christ is born. The shepherds are there first, and the wise men who saw the star coming and arrive after he's been born, and not just a little bit after. They're months late. So there's an element of humor in that, I think. The wise do see it, but their timing is really, really off. But at least it's better than the rest of them. They followed the signs of the stars and got there. And Milton, though, because of his desire to honor the gift that's been given from above, wants to rush before them. And so that's his sense. So the collapsing of time and space is envisaged in this imaginative presentation here. So see how from far upon the eastern road the star-led wizards haste with odors sweet. Oh, run, prevent them with thy humble ode, and lay it lowly at his blessed feet. Have thou the honor first, thy Lord to greet, and join thy force unto the angel choir, from out his secret altar touched with hallowed fire. Terrific beginning. It begins with the occasion, and then it's the immediate outbreak into praise. And then he begins the hymn, which has a very different tone to it, and you will have noticed that. So the beginning is far more, it sets the occasion in an immediate response of praise and adoration and desire to give honor to the newborn king. And the hymn itself then goes on a very different tone in shorter lines. Still heavily structured, 27 stanzas, much more complicated metrically. The first 4 stanzas are all the same, decasyllabic followed by the hexameter, or the Alexandrine as I called it, whereas the latter 27 stanzas are very complicated metrically. It's true that each stanza is 8 lines long, and the rhyme scheme is AA, BCC, BDD. But within that, there's a great deal of variation between the stanzas. So he's not uniform in his hymnody other than having 7-line stanzas. And the first 2 rhyming couplets, the AA and the CC, so the AA here and the CC here, are 6-syllable lines, or trimeters. So it was the winter wild, while the heaven-born child. Does he stay with that? No. All meanly wrapped in the rude manger lies. Nature in awe to him had doffed her gaudy trim, with her great master so to sympathize. And note that in the B here, the lies and sympathize, we have rhyme as well, but it's separated by the rhyme between. So again, the structure is has regularity to it, but not regularity within the lines. There's a lot of interruption there. And the third and final couplet has a 8-syllable tetrameter. And then finally the concluding 12-syllable hexameter. It was no season then for her to wanton with the sun, her lusty paramour. So as far as a structured line, there's huge variation even within the stanza. It bellows out, it comes in, comes out, and then it concludes with the longer line just like he had in the first 4 stanzas. But as I say, the rhyming couplets here and here are like a bookends, and the line in the middle is held within those 2 lines. And here, of course, what lies between the 2 couplets is the manger, which is sort of emphasized. It jumps out because of that. And what I want to suggest when you are analyzing poetry, its meter, its rhythm, its verse form, is first of all just to note what's going on. That's the first thing when you're analyzing poetry you have to do, is to observe what's going on and where are the similarities and differences between the lines. And then comes the question of why has the poet done this? In the observation, there ought to be more or less unanimity. We can observe that it is this way. The question of why it is this way pushes into the question of interpretation then. And at that point, we can probably get a great deal of disagreement amongst us. We ought to be able to get agreement when it comes to the metrical analysis, the verse analysis, the formal analysis. But when it comes to the explanation for the form, then we can start to see the differences arise between this. So the first section of the 29 stanza hymn can be divided or subdivided into various parts, and I'll just list these for you. Firstly, there's the response of creation to the entrance of the Creator into what he has created. This should be more shocking to us than it usually is. The reason it isn't shocking to us is because we are influenced by the Romantics, who are pantheists and collapse the Creator and the creation anyway. They see no distinction between the Creator and the creation. They think that the Creator is in the creation. We think that God is in the created order. God is in nature. That's what we already, thanks to the Romantics, we think that God resides in nature. That's why nature is good. That's why we can defile nature. That's why we have to show reverence for nature. The whole environmental movement is suffused with this sentiment of panentheism. But Milton's day would have recognized that in terms of Christian theology, the Creator is totally separate from the creation. He's outside space and time. He pre-exists, the ontological Trinity pre-exists the created order altogether. God exists before anything else does. He brings it into existence. And so for the immaterial God who exists outside space and time to enter time and space is itself a shocking concept. And I think the shock, as I say, is less apparent to us because we don't think theologically correctly on this. And Milton, however, is aware of the significance of that. That is the miracle of the incarnation. Right? If you think about this, that you exist outside the conditions of the thing that you create, and then you subject yourself to the limitations of those created conditions, this itself is a miracle and a gift that deserves praise. If you further do that to redeem the very thing that you created from its fallenness by entering into that created order and using the conditions of that created order, that's an additional miracle, and of course that is exactly what he's saying. But I need to bring that to your attention because, again, those of us who think that God is in nature or all around us tend not to see this, the magnitude of the incarnation and its significance here. So it was the winter wild while the heaven-born child, all meanly wrapped in the rude manger lies. Nature, in awe to him, had doffed her gaudy trim. It took off its clothing, as it were. It's not wearing the clothes of the spring and the summer and the fall. It's lost its leaves. There are no flowers. It's doffed her gaudy trim with her master so to sympathize, because God, who is clothed in splendor, comes down as a naked little baby. And nature does likewise. I'll take my clothes off. Now, Milton's setting it in the midst of winter. Well, it's in Israel. There's no snow probably there, right? But it's in the midst of December even. It's maybe colder then, but it's certainly not that cold, and there's no snow. It's almost certainly the case. It was no season then for her to wanton with the sun, her lusty paramour. Now, nature here is presented in quasi-pagan terms, but nonetheless acknowledges Christ. So only with speeches fair she woos the gentle air to hide her guilty front with the innocent snow, and on her naked shame pollute with sinful blame the saintly veil of maiden white to throw. Confounded that her Maker's eyes should look so near upon her foul deformities. So the natural world, although she is naked, just like the babe is, her nakedness reveals something that his nakedness does not. Remember that Adam and Eve before the fall are naked and unashamed. After the fall, they hide themselves and try and cover themselves up. And that action by Adam and Eve is being replicated here by nature itself. It's aware of its fallenness in the presence of one who is unfallen. So it's personification of nature is what Milton is doing here, following the pattern of Adam and Eve, aware of its unworthiness to host somebody who is yet unfallen. So again, it's personifying nature and presenting nature itself as doing the same reverence and awe that Milton himself begins the whole ode with. But he, her fears to cease, sent down the meek-eyed peace. She, crowned with olive green, came softly sliding down through the turning sphere, his ready harbinger. With turtle wing the amorous clouds dividing, and waving wide her myrtle wand, she strikes a universal peace through sea and land. Now, myrtle, as the note will suggest here, is commonly used at weddings and special occasions like Valentine's Day for love. And in the iconography of the Middle Ages, 16th century, 17th century, myrtle will be a sign of love. So whenever you read poets refer to myrtle, they have in mind love. Now, what sort of love here is the question. But there's a romance and a devotion and a beauty and a love. As it says here, and this is interesting, and Milton would most certainly have known this, to Jews, Arabs, and Persians, myrtle is also a symbol of paradise. And paradise here, in that sense, regained by the very incarnation of God. Paradise, which was lost by Adam and Eve, has been regained by the Son of God. And the sign of the myrtle shows the return of Eden. In the very incarnation, Eden has been restored. So paradise, which was once lost, is now been regained. And I say this in those terms because what we see in this very early poem by Milton is a reflection of the themes that will be present in his poetic canon throughout his life and gain expression later on. Yes?
This question isn't strictly related to that.
That's okay.
If you just actually move the
This out of the way.
yeah, for 1 second, is the eyes and deformities and wand and land supposed to rhyme? Like, is it supposed to be D, and then at the end of both of those?
Wand and land, yes.
Would it have been pronounced differently back then than it is now? Like, is eyes and deformities supposed to rhyme and wand and land as well?
So what would rhyme besides wand and land? Oh, I see, wand and land. Well, wand and land are considered metrically that it's considered a rhyme, even though they're, so you're going to still pronounce them wand and land. It's not wand and laund,
Right, okay, so then they would just consider that.
or wand and land. Yes, it's considered to rhyme.
Okay.
Yes.
That was just my question. 'Cause
Yeah.
every time I was reading it,
Yeah, you want to rhyme it because, right?
Yeah, the last two always seemed like they should rhyme because they look similar. So.
No. I mean, first of all, it's possible that it was pronounced differently,
Right.
but it's considered to rhyme even if it's pronounced differently in pronunciation. We will consider it to be a rhyme.
Okay.
Yeah. And you'll find that in poetry in general, that that's sufficient to be considered a rhyme. And yeah, enough said on that. And you'll note that when he comes to write Paradise Lost, Milton decides to avoid writing and rhyming couplets, even though it's the fashion of the day. Says that actually it's the product of a barbaric age to demand that we write in rhyme at all times. And the ancients who wrote epics never wrote in rhyming couplets, and I'm not going to be constricted by that convention, which is of our era, because I'm writing in a tradition that spans long before our barbaric age. Why is it barbaric? I mean, it's the Renaissance, it's Christian humanism. How can you say it's barbaric? Because it's fallen away from the true Christian humanism which Milton represents, which is not constrained by rhyming couplets. That's an artificial adornment that he is not going to be bound by. Note that that's not true throughout his poet. He has no problem with rhyme. He will use it. He's just not going to use it for the epic. The grandest theme, he could not write, if he were worried about rhyme, every line would be dedicated to that restriction. When it comes to the 18th century, the great Alexander Pope will write rhyming couplets. Milton would say, well, you've clipped your own wings by presenting yourself that way. But again, that will be the dominant tendency. John Dryden will also write in rhyming couplets right after Milton. Say Milton objects. For the reasons of culture, and they say you should rhyme for the purposes of culture. That's the influence of France on English writing when Dryden does it and Pope does it. France is the dominant cultural power. But for Milton, France is Catholic, and that's not the objection. The metrical shackles, he thinks, will constrain his poetic voice. Anyway, I went off on an angle there. But that counts as a rhyme. But note, he graciously is seeking to alleviate the fears even of nature there, and is striking a shalom in the midst of all the creation. Even though the creation is aware of its deformities and its unworthiness, he is saying effectively the same thing as George Herbert does in his poem Love, that although she is unworthy, he has called her worthy by becoming part of nature. So that's the thing. When Christ becomes incarnate, nature is being granted a dignity which she naturally lacks, which she originally would have had. But now it's not just the addition of an unfallen creature in the midst of it, it's the God that created the whole thing. It's an additional dignity that was never possessed of the original creation. God never was a part of the created order. So it's not just a restoration to the original state of affairs where there's an unfallen man now in the midst of the world. The God who created that originally unfallen creation has now become a part of it in his mortal or in his human person. I think that's often neglected when people talk about the second Adam. The second Adam is not like the first Adam because he is also divine. Anyway, but there's a universal peace, and he'll go on this train of thought for a few stanzas yet. No war or battle's sound was heard the world around. The idle spear and shield were high uphung. The hooked chariot stood, unstained with hostile blood. The trumpet spake not to the armed throng, and kings sate still with awful eye, as if they surely knew their sovereign Lord was by. But peaceful was the night, wherein the Prince of Light his reign of peace upon the earth began. The winds with wonder wist, and smoothly the waters kissed, whispering new joys to the mild ocean, who now hath quite forgot to rave, while birds of calm sit brooding on the charmed wave. The stars with deep amaze. Note that he moves from different venue to one venue to the next, and it's like a chorus. We'll start with the bass, and then we'll move on to the tenors, and then we'll move on to the, right? They'll just go through the whole choir. The choir of nature in its different component parts are going to sing the same song. And although he comes in contrast, or in one sense, in his holiness, in contrast to the fallenness of the world, he comes not to judge the world. He comes not to bring the sword. There's no war here. There's peace in the midst of, they're at war with him, but he's not at war with them. That's very interesting and consistent with the emphasis of Scripture on this. The stars with deep amaze stand fixed in steadfast gaze, bending one way their precious influence, and will not take their flight for all the morning light, or Lucifer that often warned them thence, but in their glimmering orbs did glow, until their Lord himself bespake and bid them to go. Now here, Lucifer, which we will immediately associate with Satan, is a reference to the light-bearing Venus. And with Venus, the goddess of love. And though the shady gloom had given day her room, the sun himself withheld his wonted speed and hid his head for shame. Even the sun is bashful in the presence of this greater light. And hid his head for shame, as his inferior flame the new enlightened world no more should need. He saw a greater sun appear than his bright throne or burning axle tree could bear. Metonymy for the sun's chariot going along the chariot has wheels that cut a groove into the line. Anyway, the shepherds on the lawn, or ere the point of dawn, sate simply chatting in a rustic row. Full little thought they then that the mighty Pan was kindly come to live with them below. Perhaps their loves, or else their sheep, was all did they their silly thoughts so busy keep. Now he's referred to as Pan. Now Pan is a little boy in Greek mythology that plays a flute and so forth. But here it's an image of Christ, which he plucks directly from Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar and from his poem May. And it literally the Greek word means all, everything. Because everything has just come to the created order, and Pan is bigger than the created order. So in Greek mythology, Pan is just a lesser deity that represents nature in its smallness, even there in classical mythology, but still. Whereas in here, the Pan, everything has come to something comparatively small. So Pan is vested with a new significance. And that, again, he plucks directly from Edmund Spencer's Shepherd's Calendar, where the shepherd, again, is Christ, also referred to as Pan. So again, he's what he's doing, and I said to you last semester with respect to C.S. Lewis, when he refers to Father Christmas, etc., or we'll talk about Pan, or we'll talk about Dryads, or we'll talk about, what else will he talk about? Who comes there with his pards? Bacchus and so forth. It's not Bacchus that's coming. It's a symbol of Christ. It's not just Bacchus, and it's Father Christmas is not just Father Christmas. These are also symbols of Christ. All of these are symbols of Christ that are coming to him. And he doesn't spend enough time perhaps investing meaning to it, but these are all symbols of Christ that have been used by Protestant writers in allegorical form throughout the Christian tradition. Again, it's not to Tolkien's taste, but it is actually a better established way of representing Christian truth than the one that Tolkien uses, where he presents it in sort of a pure myth of his own invention. Not to criticize Tolkien, but to defend Lewis. So those are the first 8 stanzas of the of the hymn. And at that point, having from locations, various locations, given praise to the incarnate Son, it moves to the sort of the cosmological significance, and it then reflects on music. And I have said repeatedly in my classes, because otherwise people wouldn't be aware of it, that in Milton's day, and those with classical learning will understand astronomy as one of the 7 liberal arts, and they posit grand significance to astronomy. It's the realm of the created order that the wise study. Astronomy, the spheres, the heavens, they cast their gaze not to the earth, but rather upwards. And by reading the constellations of the planets, they also will make certain forecast predictions about what's going to happen on earth in the heaven. And that's what the wizards themselves did, the 3 wise men. They looked at the constellations of the planets, they consulted their charts, and said something is about to happen that has never happened before. We better go to the place where these prophecies tend. Where did they get that from? Well, not from the constellations, but rather from the scriptures. So they took the constellation of the planets, their study of astronomy, fused it with what scripture spoke about the prophecy of the Messiah and that he would come to Bethlehem, and they rush to Bethlehem. They get the timing wrong. So the astronomy was inaccurate in terms of timing. The venue of Bethlehem was entirely accurate because one came from the scriptures and the other came from the study of the heavens. So it's an inexact science, but nonetheless it still is a science. And how inexact? Well, astronomy is again connected with music and with arithmetic and geometry, and in general we would say arithmetic is highly exact, highly precise, right? It's the thing on which modern science wholly depends on the validity of mathematics. And Milton connects mathematics and the precision of mathematics, the way of learning and understanding reality through number, with the science that we will call music. And I do call it a science because Milton would have understood it that way, although you can call it an art or a science, and it's the same thing. By the way, it's a branch of knowledge. But it's one to be understood through numbers, not through words, and certainly not through feelings per se. So we mustn't romanticize what we mean by music here. So let me backtrack a little bit here. For those of you who haven't heard me say this before, and I can't assume that you have heard me, but I know that some of you have, so I am repeating myself a little bit. So I beg your forgiveness. But there are 7 liberal arts. The word-based arts of the trivium, and that will be grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And then there will be 4 arts that are number-based. And these will be the quadrivium, the 4 ways. In both cases, the vium is the ways. And these will be mathematics, music, geometry, and astronomy. If you, as a Renaissance man, want to recover the knowledge of the ancient world, which we applaud, all of the words that we use in the intellectual life largely come from the Greeks and the Romans. All of them. Even the words that are used here are Greek words that the Romans simply use and adapt and continue on with that. But politics is a Greek word, and rhetoric is a Greek word, astronomy is a Greek word, physics is a Greek word, metaphysics is a Greek word. Aristotle's whole poetic or philosophical corpuses contains words that we now use to describe the disciplines of knowledge that we recognize as knowledge. And you can understand reality in one of two ways. You can understand it through words, or you can understand it through numbers. And to this day, we still think that learning is basically reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? And people get angry at the 3 R's not being emphasized in education enough. The 3 R's being a demonstration that they're illiterate, because, but anyway, so there's no small irony in that. But basically, they're saying if we want to educate our children, the basic things that they need to understand is to be able to read and write, have the logos as part of their education, and they have to be able to deal with numbers. Well, why numbers? Because numbers are another way of learning about reality. And these mathematical disciplines, these number disciplines, are very different. This is number in abstraction. Everyone will tell you that numbers don't represent any physical object at all. It's an intellectual necessity. The number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you never see a discrete object called a number 1 or 2 fourth. It's a denotation that we use to connote an intellectual necessity. Zeros as well, right? Like it's a concept, and it's an abstract concept, one that we use numbers rather than words to represent because it requires that level of abstraction. So mathematics is the purest of these. It's just number abstractly conceived. Music is that abstraction being audible and sensibly perceived. And you will be able to see an order in the midst of all of that otherwise abstract notion of the reality being subject to our abstraction. But music will show us that in the midst of all of the possibilities within that abstraction, there are certain numbers that create harmony. And we can connect a musical scale with those. And the exact frequency of that you can mathematically precisely demarcate. And you can hear it. And if you have pitch perfect, if you're pitch perfect, you can also represent it when you sing. You can sing that exact note. And if somebody is off key, you will know it. Right? That person cannot sing. Oh, would you please stop? How come that same person who we say can't sing and can't hear music and they're praising to God? Why are we objecting? Well, because they're singing the wrong note. Where do we get the sense of wrongness from? From a sense of the order and harmony of all created things. There's a beauty that attends music which we can hear through our senses. So now that abstraction is accommodated to our incarnated being. But we sense an order in music that's there. Geometry, just briefly speaking, is number expressed through the extension of space. You can measure. And astronomy is number through time, extended through time. And time is the venue of God's created order, and time matters very much to the concept of history, if it has any meaning. Right? And we invest a huge amount of meaning as Christians to what happens in space and time, because we recognize that God is a creator and the venue of his providence is human history. So the study of astronomy is closely allied to history, which is related to time. And so all of these subjects, the quadrivium and the trivium, are the 7 liberal arts. So when Milton here at this point makes a reference to music, he's reflecting on the creaturely significance of the harmony of peace brought about by the incarnation of God. And he's going to reflect that in multiple ways. But those 7 liberal arts, recognized and taught in medieval universities, and the 7 liberal arts constituting the whole of human knowledge, become Christianized in the medieval university, because the incarnation changes our understanding of all 7 of the liberal arts. And what the Trinity does is it allows us to breach the divide that I think confounded the ancient world, which is the problem of whether ultimate reality is one in nature or many in nature. Parmenides and his tradition of philosophy would suggest that ultimate reality is one, and being is the category of ultimate philosophical veritude. Heraclitus would suggest rather otherwise, but particularly the atomists would say that ultimate reality is the discrete individual objects there. Democritus and so forth, and they will say that ultimate reality is all of these things that we see around us. The desk, me, the table, the snow outside, the trees, those are all real. And they're all discrete objects. They're not just one, they're many. How do we, and we'll say that both things have a point. If we don't have the concept of unity, we can't really speak of reality at all. We're just appearances. It's like the Hindus say, it's Maya. It's just a bunch of objects. But they're not real. And then we get into nominalism. And the debate in the church of the medieval period between nominalism and the reason, what unites the one and the many is the Trinity. That God is at the same time ultimately one and ultimately many. So the Trinity is the very thing, the concept of the Trinity is the thing that brings together the idea of abstraction that we get from unity and yet intellectual connectiveness, at the same time as acknowledging the particularity of created existence. And God becoming human is the very thing that allows us to apprehend that and realize that in the hearing of music. If that makes any sense. I'm theologizing a bit here, but that's the significance of this. And so when he goes into music, he then goes into a subject, and I think I put this, no I didn't, it's not there. It's on the syllabus here. When we come to this extract, I'll just read what so I put on the course website, Boethius's De Institutione Musicae, on the website, and you can by all means look at that. But Boethius, when it comes to this topic of music, the profound Christian philosopher best known for Consolation of Philosophy, also writes a treatise on music. Also writes, by the way, the sort of definitive understanding of human nature. But I won't get onto that rabbit trail right now. But this treatise is read and used in the Western world as the musical textbook all the way from the 5th century to the 18th century, including Milton's day. So it's not just a random association by me connecting it to Boethius. And what does Boethius say? He connects and describes, and to use my own word here, and we'll put it up for the readers there, the Pythagorean unity of mathematics and music, and he discusses the Platonic concept of the relationship between music and society. So, and I've reiterated this, but what I haven't done that here. Okay, so there are 3 types of music according to Boethius. 3 types. One is the musica instrumentalis. This is the most widely recognized type of music. It's through instruments. The instrument can be a guitar, a piano, a violin, you name it. Or your voice. That is an instrument as well. And you can hear that music. But why would you play that music? And how would you know that it was musical, what you did, and not just noise? It's because within your frame, within your person, there's something that Boethius calls the musica humana. And that musica humana will recognize whether something is on key or off key, whether it's harmonious or discordant, whether what you hear clangs and suggests conflict, or whether it suggests harmony and peace. So those 2 senses seem obvious to us. There's a music that we can hear, And whether it's good music depends on our sense internally that that is actually harmonious or musical, or if it's not, and it's just a bunch of noise. Like you can't sing, you can't play music at all. That stop banging the. You're not making music at all. You're just making a noise. Stop that, little children. It's really irritating. Stop making it. The third element which Boethius introduces is the one that's connected to astronomy. And that is the music of the spheres. So the music that we play through the instrumental music of our voice or through musical instruments, which we hear through our ears and feel delight in, if it's harmonious and beautiful. The reason we do so is it corresponds to the music of the spheres of astronomy, of the heavens. And with that in mind, he has a Ptolemaic cosmology. And the music of the spheres here. I hate this. I've got to get rid of Bing. Is that going to work for me? No, I don't want that one. I don't want that one, really. Is there not a better one than that? Come on. There we go. That's what I want. Pop-ups. Oh, there we go. The music of the spheres. So the 8 notes of a musical scale correspond to the planets. And between these planets are crystalline spheres that reverberate and make a music. Inaudible to the human ear, because we are in the fallen world, on the silent planet, as Lewis would call it. Whereas the music of the spheres is heard in the heavens. It's what the choirs of angels are singing and praising God right now, which we also do not hear. But our human music is already approximating and anticipating. When we create beautiful music, we're actually anticipating and trying to sing with the degree of beauty and joy and delight what the angels are already singing, and one day we too will sing when we are transposed into glory upon our deaths. We will continue to sing, but more perfectly. If we can't sing now, we will be singing then. Our voices will be fixed, and we'll hear the way things ought to really be sung and so forth. That's what is connoted in the music of the spheres, and it's what Milton has in mind here in the Nativity Ode. When such music sweet their hearts and ears did greet, as never was by mortal finger strook. See? Point I just made. As never was by mortal finger struck. Divinely warbled voice, answering the stringed noise, as all their souls in blissful rapture took. The air such pleasure loath to lose, with thousand echoes still prolongs each heavenly close. A close is the stop on the, imagine a flute or something like that. The closes on it, or an organ. Nature that heard such sound beneath the hollow round of Cynthia's seat. Cynthia is again Venus. The airy region thrilling now was almost won, to think her part was done, and that her reign had here its last fulfilling. She knew such harmony alone could hold all heaven and earth in happier union. So the whole natural order, which gives us beauty that itself draws us to God, is only there for a specific time and for a specific purpose. When there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, that purpose will pass away. And the incarnation is the beginning of the last days. It's the beginning of the new heaven and the new earth, the moment of the incarnation. And all of our earthly music, which in its best form reminds us of heavenly things, is only a dim foreshadow of the very thing that Lewis talks about in the Narnia Chronicles, that the reason we love the old Narnia is because it reminds us of this place. That's what he has in mind here. So, at last surrounds their sight a globe of circular light, that with long beams the shamefaced night arrayed, The helmed cherubim and sworded seraphim are seen in glittering ranks with wings displayed, harping in loud and solemn choir with unexpressive notes to heaven's newborn heir. Such music as to said before was never made, but when of old the sons of morning sung, while the Creator great his constellations set, and the well-placed world on hinges hung, and cast the dark foundations deep, and bid the weltering waves their oozy channel keep. He harkens back to the creation of the world when the sons of morning sung at what God did in creating the world. Plucks this from Job, but Job reflecting on the early foundation of the whole created order and the praise of the angels at God's work there, which Tolkien in his Silmarillion, he makes a strong emphasis on the musical nature of creation. If you have any interest in Tolkien on that, he talks about Iluvatar making a song, and that brings about it. And if you want to look at Lewis's own corpus on that, in The Magician's Nephew, the lion sings things into creation and picks up that sense in Christian theology that praises to God and even prayers to God which are sung are twice honorable. So there's a significance to song that is like prayer. And then Milton then addresses that specifically. Ring out ye crystal spheres, these spheres that reside between the planets here. I could actually find it presented in crystal spheres if I got a three-dimensional. There it is, more like that. There's better images than that. Once bless our human ears, if ye have power to touch our senses so, and let your silver chime move in melodious time, and let the bass of heaven's deep organ blow, and with your ninefold harmony make up full consort to the angelic symphony. For if such holy song enwrapped our fancy long, time will run back and fetch the age of gold, a return to the golden age. And speckled vanity will sicken soon and die, and leprous sin will melt from earthly mold, and hell itself will pass away, and leave her dolorous mansions to the peering day. Yea, truth and justice then will down return to men, the enameled arras of the rainbow wearing, and mercy set between, throned in celestial sheen, with radiant feet the tissued clouds down steering, and heaven, as at some festival, will open wide the gates of her high palace hall. But wisest fate, now here's the little bit of a turn in there, so that's one appeal to the music of the spheres, announcing if we could possibly hear that music, that we hear it right now because of the cosmic significance that the heavens themselves attest to, and which we can't hear. Can we hear it just this once? Because that is actually what is happening, is the reconciliation between heaven and earth is being worked out here. But wisest fate says, no, this must not yet be so. The babe lies yet in smiling infancy. So Milton has been anticipating the whole consequence of the incarnation in everything he said up to this point. And so here's then the but hold on. The purpose of the babe coming and becoming incarnate is to do the reconciliation, and that awaits the cross. So this must not yet be so. The babe lies yet in smiling infancy, that on the bitter cross must redeem our loss. So both himself and us to glorify. Yet first to those he chained in sleep, the wakeful trump of doom must thunder through the deep. With such a horrid clang, and as on Mount Sinai rang, while the red fire and smoldering clouds outbreak, the aged earth aghast with terror of that blast shall from the surface to the center shake, when at the world's last session the dreadful judge in middle air shall spread his throne. And then at last our bliss full and perfect is, but now begins. For from this happy day the old dragon underground in straighter limits bound, not half so far casts his usurped sway, and wrath to see his kingdom fail swinges the scaly horror of his folded tail. Okay, so that's the second movement, is the appeal to the music of the spheres and the significance of the cosmic harmony, the peace of God, the shalom of God, which will resonate and be heard through all ages. The third movement, from 19 onwards, is the response of the pagans, the pagan world. And it's a whole series of references to things that are appealed to as sages or prophets of what will come. And one of them, the one referred to here in 19, is the oracles, which famously were said to go silent when Christ came. So the Oracle of Delphi, famously referred to throughout the classical world as the utmost oracle dedicated to Apollo, went silent when Christ came, and people stopped going to the Delphic Oracle because there were no more oracles given. Now this is testified to in some of the church fathers, but this is one of the signs that prophecy has been fulfilled in the coming of the Messiah, is that the oracles consulted by the pagans are no longer speaking to them. And the demons that were behind those oracles are now silenced as a consequence of the incarnation. Now, we don't usually hear much about that because it would have no contemporary relevance, but there is testimony to that if you read the church fathers and testimonies of that era, that the pagan oracles were silenced and they just went dead. That's it. And Milton picks that up here. The oracles are dumb. They don't speak. They can't speak. No voice or hideous hum runs through the arched roof in words deceiving. Apollo from his shrine can no more divine. Mentioned also in Virgil's Aeneid. But the Pythoness, mentioned in the book of Acts, where the oracle of Delphi was held. Apollo from his shrine can no more divine, with hollowed shriek the steep of Delphos leaving. No nightly trance or breathed spell inspires the pale-eyed priest from the prophetic cell. The lonely mountains o'er, and the resounding shore a voice of weeping heard, and loud lament from haunted spring and dale edged with poplar pale. The parting genius is with sighing sent, with flower inwoven tresses torn, and nymphs in twilight shade of tangled thickets mourn. And so what he will talk about here from here on, and I'm going to conclude with this rather than go through all these, he will then list all of the divinities, whether large or small, which are put in their place and are no longer worshipped for what they are as a consequence of the coming of the true king. And he'll go with everything from what I've just said, the Delphic oracle, to the Lars and the Lemurs and the Famine and the Peor and the Baalim and the Ashtaroth and Hammon and Thammuz and Moloch and so forth. These are all divinities that he will cite in Book 1 of Paradise Lost and in the Great Council of Hell. They will come and speak, giving guidance on what Satan and the cohorts ought to do to try and retake heaven. So he will cite them all and pronounce their conquest by virtue of the incarnation. And the incarnation is said to include, of course, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension, but all that is anticipated in the incarnation there. Sullen Moloch fled, Osiris is gone, Typhon is gone, the sun itself, the fairies, and we'll conclude with the concluding lines of the poem where he returns to the venue of the incarnation, namely the woman. But see, the virgin blessed hath laid her babe to rest. Time is our tedious song should here have ending. Heaven, note that the final stanza is different in its meter and rhyme scheme than the ones that came before it. I just note it. You can think about that and reflect on how it changes and why it changes. I'll leave that to you. Time is our tedious song should here have ending. Heaven's youngest teamed star hath fixed her polished car. Her sleeping lord with handmaid lamp attending. And all about the courtly stable, bright harnessed angels sit in order, serviceable. So that's the Nativity Ode. It's a splendid cosmological poem on the cosmic significance of the Incarnation. It includes the historical dimension in the appeal to astronomy. It includes the aesthetic dimension in the appeal to music. It includes the reference to the theological dimension by referring to the pagan gods. It refers to the conquest of the coming king and the fact that the king is the Prince of Peace, even though he will be greeted as a threat to the powers that be. He will not respond by crushing them, and yet their end is sure. He comes at it through the vehicle of the crucifixion, and he will defeat them by defeating sin and death, etc., as we know. But all the themes that we will find throughout Milton's poetic corpus to the very end are already announced in his very first great poem, which is the Nativity Ode. It is a great, great poem. And I wanted to spend a whole class on it just to give you a sense of that. But you get the sense of the unanimity of vision, or you will by the end of the course, the unanimity of vision, or the unity of vision that he has even early on. He knows what he wants to write about. And he holds on to that. And he has the biggest of the big pictures of the significance of Christ and his kingdom already at 21. Okay, I'll leave you with that.